everyone, it's Katrina, Sri Lanka's hidden Stargate. Stargate Cappern looks like a portal to a distant land far away in the cosmos. The Stargate is in the small Austrian town of Cappern, but it doesn't have any magical powers. It's a replica of the Stargate from the TV series Stargate, used on the show to create a wormhole that can transport somebody to another planet in the blink of an eye. And while this particular Stargate was made by a local artist as a fun monument, there might be a real gate on the other side of the world, in Sri Lanka. It doesn't exactly look like a Stargate though. The mysterious gateway to another dimension is carved on a rock at the Ranbasu Uyana site in Anuradhapura. It's inside an ancient garden that was used as a relaxation place for the royal family of the Anuradhapura kingdom, founded by King Pandukabaya in 437 BC. This was the first true kingdom to dominate ancient Sri Lanka. Their influence spread to all corners of the country, with the king seen as the supreme lord and commander of all the island people, who were mostly Buddhists. They were invaded by South Indians a few times, but managed to hold on. They lasted all the way until 1017, when Chola Emperor Rajaraja I invaded Anuradhapura and the city fell into chaos and ruin. But what's the deal with the Stargate? It's a bizarre thing, a carving on a flat piece of stone that appears to show unknown symbols. Scientists don't know what the symbols mean, so the whole thing looks like it's covered in an ancient alien language. There's no explanation for it. Mainstream archaeologists will tell you it's some kind of calendar, though that doesn't seem to make much sense. Many believe it was a gate built by extraterrestrials, aliens who needed to transport gold from Earth back to their own world, and who used the early civilizations of our planet to mine that gold for them. But of course, there's no proof. What do you think about Stargates? Let me know in the comments. It's shoutout time! I want to give a big thank you to Grape Ape and Ronald Messina for supporting this channel. Thanks, guys! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about amazing discoveries. The Cliff Dwellings. The Gila Cliff Dwellings in New Mexico hold secrets archaeologists can only hope to unravel. The Cliff Dwellings were used as an ancient settlement by a little-known branch of the Mogollon people 1,000 years ago. They're known as the Mimbres Mogollon, and they appeared around the year 1000 AD in the dry wasteland of the southwest United States. The natural caves carved by erosion into the sides of the canyons here made for an excellent place to settle. The ancient people then got to work building their homes inside the rock nooks, where they stayed for about 130 years. But what happened before and after that is a huge mystery. Archaeological evidence shows humans were living in the rock shelters at least 2,000 years ago. The cliff dwellings had already been lived in and abandoned by the time the Mimbres Mogollon showed up and built their own houses. Who these earlier people were is a question scientists have had a tough time answering. The cliffs cover an area of about 553 acres, with the main buildings being sheltered inside 5 main alcoves. All the alcoves overlook Cliff Dweller Canyon, which opens to the Gila River. We have to assume that when the people built their homes here, there was rain and food. It would have taken a lot of work to build the homes out of mud and rock, so they must have been well fed and taken care of. Evidence found throughout the dwellings shows each unit consisted of 10 or 15 families. These families, scrunched together in the shade beneath the rock, maintained a steady diet of squash, corn, and beans. They also likely ate meat from deer and bison when they could catch one. But then, something happened. By 1130 AD, the cliff people were gone, and nobody knows where they went. It took little more than a century for them to abandon the canyon, likely because they ran out of rain and couldn't feed themselves anymore. But that's only an educated guess, and in reality, archaeologists don't know the truth of the missing Mogollons. The Buried Pyramid. The Buried Pyramid, aka the Pyramid of Sekhemkhet, is an unfinished pyramid that was built 4,600 years ago. It was constructed during the reign of Sekhemkhet Djoserti, the second pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty. This was in the infancy of ancient Egypt, at the beginning of the Old Kingdom when pyramids had just become popular. It was right after the transition from prehistoric desert dwellers who worshipped beasts to the age of the pyramids. Nobody even knew this pyramid existed until 1951. when it was found by Egyptologist Zachariah Gonaim. He noticed an unusual shape sticking out of the desert sand while doing excavations on something completely different nearby. The pyramid was cleared, its bottom was revealed, and it was measured at a measly 17 feet tall and 60 feet thick. Strangely, the pyramid was right in the middle of being completed when it was abandoned. But it wasn't totally a waste. Archaeologists dug through to the core of the pyramid, down a sealed passage, and into a gallery which contained a rotten wooden casket. There was also a small assortment of treasure, gold bracelets, beads, and jars. The jars were inscribed with Sekhemkhet's name, so clearly, this was meant to be his place of eternal rest. It took 3 years for archaeologists to dig their way to the burial chamber. Inside was a magnificent alabaster sarcophagus hewn from a single chunk of stone. Its lid was vertical, something quite unusual when dealing with ancient sarcophagi. It looked sealed, and everyone was hoping to witness one of the oldest royal mummies in Egyptian history. However, when they finally opened the ancient casket, it was empty. This has created a lot of problems for historians. Why was the sarcophagus empty but still sealed? And why would his body have been stolen while the gold in the other room was left alone? None of it makes any sense. And nobody knows why the pyramid complex was started but never finished. Following Zachariah Gonaim's suspicious death in 1959, interest in the pyramid waned and the investigation was abandoned. There were some excavations in later years, but the buried pyramid is still one of Egypt's greatest secrets. The Titus Tunnel. During the reign of Roman Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century AD, he commissioned one of the greatest and most mysterious engineering marvels of the ancient world. The emperor had a massive tunnel carved through a mountain to help divert floodwater. The ancient harbor city of Seleucia Pieria, located in what is now Turkey, was consistently under the threat of flooding. So the Romans dug a tunnel through the mountain to save the city and its townspeople. UNESCO has called it one of the most magnificent remains from the days of the Romans, and it's preserved almost perfectly, with its greatest engineering features still intact. Emperor Vespasian started the construction project, but it was finished long after he was gone. His son Titus continued work between 79 and 81 AD, and then it was completed in the 2nd century under Antonius Pius. Roman emperors had a thing for making sure everyone knew how much work they did. We know the exact times when specific emperors funded building projects because they left plaques with their names on them, as is the case here. Seleucia Pieria was an extremely important city in the ancient world. They received exotic goods from Asia, which they sold throughout the empire. It was also where St. Paul, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, departed for his first missionary journey, one of the first Christian missionary missions in history. But the city just kept on flooding. Engineers with the 10th Legion were behind the initial construction of the tunnel. It was supposedly a major public project, as legionaries, sailors, and slaves were used to carve the tunnel. When it was finally finished, the Titus Tunnel was almost 1 mile long. That doesn't seem like much, but remember, it was carved from solid rock. This was no easy feat, and was one of the most remarkable things the Romans ever did. It's even more impressive because the tunnel has survived all these years while barely being damaged. And because of its help in diverting floodwater, the city of Seleucia Pieria lived on until the end of the Middle Ages. The Bridgewater Triangle. Everyone has heard about the Bermuda Triangle, the triangular chunk of water in the Atlantic Ocean that's supposedly responsible for swallowing countless ships and airplanes. But what many people don't know about is the triangular patch of land between Providence, Boston, and Plymouth. It's called the Bridgewater Triangle, or as some people call it, the Bermuda Triangle of Massachusetts. The triangle became famous in the 1970s when Loren Coleman, a cryptozoologist and author of Mysterious America, defined its boundaries. Loren Coleman wrote that within the triangle were some extraordinarily unusual things happening. Also, the triangle is home to some of the most obscure archaeological sites in North America, such as Dighton Rock. Dighton Rock is a boulder that weighs about 40 tons and is covered in petroglyphs. The petroglyphs are mysterious because nobody knows who made them or what the bizarre symbols are meant to represent. And that's only one of these strange sites in the triangle. There's also Hakamak Swamp, a vast wetland that swallows people who venture too deep into its squishy quagmires. Paranormal enthusiasts are crazy about this place and believe many unsuspecting victims have been taken by the swamp, never to be seen again. And there's supposedly a ghost that hangs out at Profile Rock. This was the place where Native American Anawan of the Wampanoag tribe had a meeting with King Philip, and according to legends, his ghost is said to still haunt the place. Outside the historical sites, there is a lot of paranormal activity here. People have seen Bigfoot, most frequently lurking near the spooky swamp I just told you about. Some even believe there are dinosaurs here, as crazy as that may sound. Norton Police Sergeant Thomas Downey once reported seeing what he described as a thunderbird or a pterodactyl, some kind of enormous flying creature with a wingspan over 12 feet long. Most of the strangeness that's taken place within the Bridgewater Triangle is hearsay and speculation. Still, it's a small zone of concentrated curiosity, and many believe the Bridgewater Triangle was cursed by Native Americans centuries ago. Do you believe there's something strange going on here? Let me know in the comments. The Place of the Dead. In the 6th century BC, a civilization emerged in the central valleys of what is now Mexico. This was the Zapotec civilization, centered around Oaxaca and Mitla. The civic and ceremonial center was Monte Alban, a magnificent series of temples and pyramids built high in the hills outside Oaxaca City. At its peak, the Zapotec civilization boasted 500,000 inhabitants. They were wildly successful, extremely powerful, and just as smart as the other cultures of Mesoamerica. They were around at the same time as the Maya, but lived far to the north of the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemalan jungles. But it wasn't the Maya who threatened the Zapotec, it was the Aztecs. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century and started fighting the Aztecs, the Zapotec hid in their cities. They wished to avoid the same fate as their enemies, but were defeated by the Spaniards nonetheless in 1527. The Zapotec culture then started to decline, but didn't altogether die. There are still pockets of Zapotec living in modern Mexico, even speaking the same language as their ancestors. But now let's talk about Mitla, which isn't as famous as Monte Alban, but it's still an important place. The Zapotec believed Mitla was the gateway between their world and the realm of the dead. It was here where the elite members of society were buried, as to be closer to the underworld. A small village expanded around the ceremonial center, so by 100 AD, the place had become a fortified religious town. Not much remains of Mitla today, though, as the site is in shambles, and archaeologists are still struggling to put together the pieces of Mitla's ceremonial nature. But researchers have identified mound structures, square courtyards, and one particularly impressive temple. The temple is called Yoropai, which means House of the Vital Force. Then there are the churches built by the Spanish as a way to show domination over the Zapotec people and their culture. The Church of San Pablo was built over the exact place where the Zapotec believed the Lady of the Underworld lived. The Spanish put the church over the entrance to the underworld to keep what they thought was a very real demon from escaping. The Spanish truly feared that the devil might show up and cause them trouble. The St. Floran Uary. The St. Floran Monastery is famous for its library, its organ, and the bones in its basement. The monastery is situated in the small Austrian town of St. Florian, built in the 9th century AD as a place of worship. It's the biggest monastery in the whole country, and one of the most impressive pieces of medieval architecture in the area. St. Florian is revered as the saint of chimney sweeps. Long ago, chimney sweeping was a popular profession, and they needed their own saint to look after them. Florian also happens to be the patron saint of Poland. Since 1071 AD, the monastery has housed Augustinian canons, a community of priests who live like monks. The Great Library was commissioned in 1744. It currently contains roughly 130,000 volumes written throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. But the main reason people visit the monastery is to listen to the organ as it plays in the basilica. The Bruckner organ, named after composer Anton Bruckner, is one of the biggest working organs on the planet. It has over 7,300 pipes and 103 stops, and it's truly a thing of pure glory. Between the library filled with medieval wisdom and the spectacular organ, the St. Florian Monastery is extremely impressive. But now let's talk about what's beneath the monastery. Underneath the religious building is a tomb of mystery. The largest coffin in the collection, down in the cold and creepy halls, is Anton Bruckner himself. The composer behind the organ's name requested to be buried inside the crypt after his death in 1896. He wanted his remains to hear the organ's music for the rest of eternity. It's also believed that St. Florian is buried somewhere in the crypt, but nobody is sure where. The tomb is mostly used as a shrine to the great composer these days, although the walls are lined with the skulls and bones of over 6,000 dead people. Legend has it the bones belong to early Christians who wished to be buried near St. Florian. But again, we don't even know if the saint's remains are in the crypt. What do you think? Have you ever visited this place? Let us know in the comments. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. The Column of Marcus Aurelius. In Rome's Piazza Colonna stands the Column of Marcus Aurelius. It doesn't look like much. It's just an ordinary column like you'd expect to see in any colonnade. The biggest difference is that it's massive, roughly 2,000 years old, and it was inspired by an even more famous column. Historians believe it was created by Emperor Commodus around 180 AD in memory of his parents. The column's designer took inspiration from Trajan's column, which was set up in Rome 70 years earlier in 113 AD. Trajan's column was officially built to commemorate Emperor Trajan's military campaigns in Dacia, but it was really created as a way for the emperor to brag about his victories. The Column of Marcus Aurelius is monumental. It stands over 120 feet tall, but it looks a lot shorter because 21 feet of it is buried underground. Nobody has ever excavated the lower portion of the structure, so for now at least, it's a mystery what's down there. There could be treasure or there could be nothing but broken stone, making the column endlessly fascinating to researchers. The issue is that nobody is about to start digging in historic Roman plazas. It would set a bad precedent, and soon everyone would want to dig up chunks of the ancient city, which they kind of already are. Romans nowadays are always complaining that the city is always getting dug up while all they're trying to do is get to work. Although the column is bare today, there was originally a statue of the emperor at the top of the column which made it even taller. In the 4th century AD, the monument was marked at over 170 feet in the Regionary catalogs. There must have been something else on the column to make it that tall. But what's really wild is that the inside is hollow. There is a secret inside the column most people have no idea exists. Tourists take pictures of this thing every day and are clueless about the spiral staircase leading to a viewing platform at the very top. The inside is closed to the public though, so no visitors allowed. The Secrets of London Bridge. Bridges have been built across London's River Thames ever since the days of the Romans 2,000 years ago. The most famous of them is the London Bridge, although far older bridges existed in the spot where the current one is. There used to be homes on the bridge, and a church was built on it, and at one point it even held severed heads. Scottish rebel William Wallace had his head put on a spike and displayed on the bridge in 1305. So too did King Henry VIII's advisor, the Lord High Chancellor Thomas More. Thomas refused to recognize the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and was beheaded for it. Jack Cade, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt in 1450, had his head put on the bridge, and Bishop John Fisher's head was added in 1535. Then, in 1540, Thomas Cromwell met the same fate. People walk over the bridge every day, and tourists take pictures of it, but most visitors are totally unaware of the sick history of the heads. A German tourist visited London in 1598 and wrote in his memoir that he encountered 30 severed heads placed on the bridge. He said every part of the bridge where there wasn't a house was covered in somebody's head. This tradition of putting heads on the bridge lasted until 1661, and the final head was impaled and displayed during the rule of King Charles II. The Great Enclosure. Al-Musawarat as-Safra is the ancient city of temples in Sudan, built in the 3rd century BC on the island of Meroe. The city came into power during the Meroitic period of the Kush Kingdom, when Meroe became the center of power for the newly established empire. It lasted from 500 BC until around the 4th century AD, for a grand total of 900 years. The kingdom's influence stretched its arms throughout all of modern Sudan and up into Egypt, ceasing at the Nile's second cataract. The City of Temples was exactly what it sounds like. It was a city dominated by monuments, temples, and buildings like mythological labyrinth complexes. The whole place is in ruins, but some of the walls and the foundations can still be found today. There's the Great Hafir Reservoir, the Lion Temple, and the Great Enclosure. The Great Enclosure's exact purpose is a bit of a mystery. It was designed as a massive labyrinth, but nobody knows what it was used for. It had multiple temples inside its walls, dedicated to unknown deities, with long, twisting corridors connecting the courtyards, terraces, and structures. The whole thing covered an enormous area of 13.5 acres. Unfortunately for archaeologists, they haven't been able to find any kind of decorations within the Great Enclosure. They have found a few sculptures of animals, pieces of graffiti that likely came after the city was ruined, but nothing to indicate a purpose. Some experts have speculated the Great Enclosure was built strictly for the worship of Apetimak, the Kushite lion god. Others believe it was a palace, and that its temples were only visited by the Meroitic kings and their personal priests. One of the more unusual theories is that the complex was an elephant training ground, with the elephants used in ancient warfare.
Temple to Hecate. In Greek mythology, Hecate is a very unusual goddess. She is considered a chthonic deity, and she's the official Greek goddess of witchcraft and ghosts. She was depicted in ancient Greece as a woman with 3 different faces, or 3 identical women standing with their backs together. One of them holds keys, another holds a torch, and the last one holds a sword. The deity's ancient cult began worshipping her over 2,000 years ago. So, the exact nature of Hecate is extremely mysterious. All we really know is that she represented a darker side of life, and many of her dedicated followers sought mystical knowledge. The little that we do know about Hecate comes from her temple at Lagina, located in modern Turkey, which was originally inhabited during the Bronze Age. The Hellenistic people living in the city constructed a great sanctuary using tall columns, kind of like a stone circle. This huge open-air sanctuary was used for ceremonies involving the goddess Hecate 2,050 years ago. Her temple here is extremely important because nothing else like it has ever been found in the ancient world. Worshipping Hecate seemed to be more of a personal thing, and archaeologists have mainly uncovered small shrines dedicated to the goddess at crossroads and within the thresholds of people's homes. There weren't grand temples dedicated to Hecate like there were for Zeus or Poseidon. Lagina seems to be the only city where she was a civic deity, respected by everyone and worshipped on a massive scale. Nesting Doll Pyramid. In 2014, archaeologists discovered something shocking about the iconic Pyramid of El Castillo in Mexico. Oddly enough, this monumental pyramid is kind of like a Russian nesting doll. Researchers learned that within the pyramid is another pyramid, and within that one is a third pyramid. El Castillo Pyramid isn't as famous as the collapsed Maya Empire or many of the other sites throughout Mexico. It was likely constructed at the very end of Maya rule, around 950 AD. At least, this was when its outermost shell was created. Researchers believe these smaller pyramids tucked inside were most likely built many centuries earlier. It's been a bit frustrating because the only way to study these smaller pyramids within is by smashing the pyramid on the outside, which nobody is interested in doing. Researchers only learned about the nesting pyramids because they use electrical resistivity tomography, or ERT, to look through the outside casing. They also identified a sinkhole directly underneath the pyramid, something that could lead to an unknown underground lair. However, why the Maya created such a strange monument is still a total mystery. Natural nuclear reactor. There is a nuclear reactor in Africa that most people don't even know exists. It's special in the fact that it is 2 billion years old. And while that sounds like a conspiracy theory, it's 100% true. The reactor is natural, formed at a unique place in Gabon where you can find naturally occurring uranium inside the Earth's crust. Uranium, as you likely know already, is extremely radioactive. The natural conditions here are just right to create nuclear reactions without the need for human intervention. The first human-made nuclear reactor didn't produce electricity until 1951, and even then, it only produced a small amount of energy. However, 2 billion years ago, a pile of rocks accomplished something that took humans thousands of years to figure out. The natural reactor was found by French scientists in 1972, when they were taking uranium ore out of a mine in Gabon. They were shocked to see that the uranium-235 was already in the process of nuclear fission. Uranium-235 naturally decays into thorium before producing a neutron. This neutron is then attracted to the closest uranium-235 atom, which begins the fission process. Nuclear fission is nothing more than atoms breaking apart into smaller atoms and releasing energy. This was already occurring naturally in the mine in Gabon because groundwater was trickling into the cavern, acting as a regulating substance that fueled the nuclear fission process. As atoms began to break apart and create neutrons, the water would slow down the neutrons' movement. The energy produced in this process would eventually heat up the water as well. Over time, the groundwater would get so hot that it would begin to boil off. Then, once all the water was boiled away, more groundwater would trickle into the mine, starting the process over again. It was never enough to create any significant energy, but it's still a fascinating ancient place that proves just how amazing the raw power of our planet is. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Ali Everett and MabaWitch23 for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about amazing discoveries and mysterious history. The Hill of the Pharaohs. The ancient city of Buto, also called Tel El Farain, or the Hill of the Pharaohs in English, is located in Egypt. This mysterious city is east of Alexandria at the lip of the Nile Delta, and it was a very important place to the ancient Egyptians. They dedicated the city to the goddess Wadjet, one of the oldest of all the Egyptian deities. Wadjet, sometimes referred to as Buto, was the original local goddess of pre-dynastic Egypt. She was worshipped by the people of Lower Egypt before the unification of the country took place over 4,500 years ago. Then, when Lower and Upper Egypt fused together, Wadjet became the official goddess of the kingdom. The city of Buto was named in her honor and was the epicenter for cult worship of Wadjet during the Second Dynasty, which began in 2890 BC. Worship of the goddess likely continued for another 2,000 years, until ancient Egypt fell to Alexander the Great in 332 BC. The reason we call this place the Hill of the Pharaohs is for the sheer number of temples that decorate the area, which spans about 11 acres. The whole place is dotted with the ruins of temples and palaces, as well as stone fragments from broken pillars. You can also find the remains of meeting halls whose ceilings were once propped up by gigantic columns. This was where the Egyptians came to offer sacrifices to the goddess Wadjet. It was a thriving religious sanctuary that is now being reclaimed by the desert. Cave of Letters. The Cave of Letters, likely one of the most important places for ancient Jewish history, was rediscovered in the 1960s about 25 miles from Qumran in the Judean desert. Qumran is the region where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found tucked away in caves and grottos. The Cave of Letters didn't contain an entire history of religious scripture like the Qumran caves, but it was still impressive for its revelations on everyday life in ancient Israel. The unassuming cave, naturally carved into the face of a cliff, was basically a time capsule. Researchers uncovered documents and multiple sets of clothing worn by Jewish people in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The hunt for the cave started when archaeologist Yigael Yadin learned of a mysterious cavern where letters had been found, written by the famous ancient Jewish revolt leader, Simon Bar Kokhba. But these treasures had been looted and sold on the black market, and so Yigael went in search of more caves, hoping to find something that hadn't already been pillaged. He found what he was looking for up a sheer rock face that was 50 feet off the ground, somewhere that's impossible to reach unless you have proper climbing equipment. Question is, how did the ancient people get up there? Within this mystery cave, he discovered letters and human remains. He also found ancient clothing, a pair of children's sandals, and household items. The letters were written by various people. One of the documents was drafted in Greek by a man named Sumaios, who researchers say was Nabatean. The letter explains that Sumaios was concerned about food issues during the Third Jewish Revolt against Rome. This was when the Jewish people tried to free themselves of their Roman oppressors. What's interesting about the letter is that it seems to show that not only Jewish people were involved in the revolt, and that other cultures the Romans had subjugated rose up to fight as well. Muiris. In 3000 BC, civilizations around the Mediterranean and in the Middle East were busy trying to conquer the world. One of the ways to do this was through trade, and spices were among the most coveted items in the ancient world. And so, 5,000 years ago, the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Egyptians arrived on the Malabar coast hoping to find some spices. They were later joined by the Arabs and Phoenicians, and gradually the city of Muiris was born. The Malabar coast is on the southwestern shore of the Indian subcontinent. Ancient people would have needed to travel a significant distance along the coast of India to reach this place. And although it was quite a distance, it wasn't as difficult as you may think. They did have boats, and it wasn't hard for these advanced civilizations to move along shorelines. Muiris soon became a key port, moving products from India to Persia, North Africa, Greece, Rome, and other places in the Mediterranean region. Famous Roman historian Pliny the Elder described it as the first emporium of India. He claimed Muiris was responsible for the exportation of pearls, Chinese silk, black pepper spice, tortoiseshells, gold coins, textiles, and so many other items. Traders with seaworthy vessels could move straight from Muiris across the ocean, along the southern coast of Arabia, and up the Red Sea to the city of Cairo. These days, the city is a miserable ruin. Something mysterious happened that caused Muiris to be abandoned in 1341. Scientists believe it was a flood that washed most of the city into the ocean. Mystery Maya Town. A team of archaeologists working with the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico recently made a shocking discovery. They uncovered evidence of the ancient Maya town of Oxcuzcab, a lost village that most people have likely never heard of before. This was a town located in what we now know as the Mexican state of Yucatan at least 1,000 years ago. After the fall of Mayapan in the 1440s, it became a regional capital. It was then occupied by the Spanish, who turned it into a colonial town in 1550. The Spanish built their Franciscan churches over the ruins of Maya temples that were destroyed. Within a century, almost nothing of the original Maya town remained. This is why it was such a big shock when archaeologists found evidence of the original structures underneath the modern city. They discovered this while they were excavating the Central Park. They found old ceramics, fragments of bone, and pieces of crumbling architecture from 1,000 years ago. The true city of Oxcuzcab is currently buried under 2 layers of history. Below, a modern 21st century city that was constructed on top of a colonial Spanish town. The oldest church in the world. The oldest church in the world is 1,789 years old as of 2022. It's located in Syria, at the archaeological site of Dura Europos. You might expect the oldest Christian church in existence to be closer to the Vatican, but instead, it's in the middle of a barren patch of dusty wasteland hundreds of miles away. The church at Dura Europos was originally built as a house in 229, but it was then converted into a chapel somewhere between 233 and 256 AD. There isn't much left of it except some crumbling sandstone walls. Even if you were to stand in the very center of the demolished structure, you would never think for a second you were in the oldest church in the world. But when scientists excavated it in the early 20th century, they found evidence of religious activities. They uncovered scrolls with prayers dating back to the 1st century AD, and they identified frescoes in an area used strictly for baptisms. These frescoes are still considered to be some of the oldest Christian images found anywhere on the planet. They depict scenes from the Gospels, such as the healing of the paralytic, Christ walking on water, and the Samaritan woman at the well. Nagarjunakonda. Nagarjunakonda is an island in India, but at one point in time it was also a city. It's one of the most important Buddhist sites in the country, and yet not too many people have ever heard of it. This ancient city is not in your typical guidebook for Indian travel. One of the main reasons for this is that the construction of the Nagarjunasagar Dam left the archaeological site flooded. One of the most important Buddhist sites in the world was suddenly underwater, and the ruins had to be relocated to higher land, which later became an island. This was a very different landscape 2,000 years ago. There was a Buddhist monastic university that attracted students from as far away as China, and people from all over India, Bengal, and even Sri Lanka used to travel here in order to get spiritual guidance. A lot of treasure has been discovered at this site throughout years of excavations. Buddhist and Hindu ruins have been identified, but that's fairly normal for a site in India. What's really caught the attention of archaeologists was when they found Roman artifacts. Researchers came across coins from between 16 and 141 AD, proving there was a connection between southern India and the Roman Empire. The Iseum. The Iseum is an ancient Roman temple built in the 2nd century AD, dedicated to an Egyptian goddess called Isis. It was excavated in the 1950s, but by then it was nothing more than a pile of rubble. This prompted archaeologists to do something extreme, and they decided to completely reconstruct the site. Through a painstaking process, they put the ancient temple back together piece by piece. It's currently in the exact same state as it was 1,800 years ago, only it's no longer in Rome. The temple hasn't moved, but the name of the land has changed to Hungary. The experts finished the Iseum in 2012, complete with the eerily beautiful shrine to Isis, a garden, and the sanctuary of Mercurius. It really does feel like you're walking back in time to when the Romans celebrated the Egyptian gods themselves. As for the history of the Iseum, it was constructed in the first part of the 2nd century, just outside the walls of the city. It was used as a shrine to Isis for about 200 years, until it was suddenly pulled down and broken apart. The people then used its stones in the construction of other buildings, and the site was turned into a cemetery. Dholavira. Dholavira is an ancient Harappan city that has been standing ever since it was first built about 5,000 years ago. It can be found in western India, named after the modern village about a mile away from it. It was here in this city where many of the most powerful people of the lost civilization once lived. It was one of the 5 major cities of Harappa, occupied for an astounding 1,500 years before it was abandoned. In comparison, New York is around 400 years old. According to UNESCO, Dholavira represents one of the best preserved ancient settlements from Southeast Asia. This city is still standing, although not in its previously pristine condition. Also, archaeologists have been able to dig up its cemetery and look at the bones of the people who once lived there. This city of Dholavira is an excellent example of how ancient people thrived in a desert environment. Even though water is scarce in this dry and barren part of India, they managed to irrigate crops and drink fresh water. They also had what some might consider a modern street layout. There was a fortified castle as well as workshops where they produced treasure from gold, ivory, and copper on a massive scale. The Harappan civilization also came up with their own language and script. However, nobody has ever been able to decipher it. Archaeologists say their language had about 400 basic signs, but many more variations. Dholavira was likely abandoned because of the inhospitable wasteland it was situated in. The place is so barren that the ruins have never been torn down, and they've hardly decayed. The Palmanova Star Fort. Palmanova is without a doubt one of the most unique cities in Italy. It was founded in 1593 during the time of the Venetian Republic. This was a sovereign state in Italy with Venice as its capital, and it was constantly at war with the Ottoman Empire. Palmanova was built at the very eastern edge of the Republic as a military station to fend off Ottoman attacks. However, it wasn't designed just to be another ugly military outpost. Famous Italian architect Vincenzo Scamozzi designed it in the shape of a 9-pointed star, and he implemented all the latest military technologies of the 16th century. The whole city was surrounded by a deep moat, and there was a defensive perimeter wall installed with tall ramparts. Access to the town was restricted to only 3 guarded gates. The city itself was then divided into individual sections, with each chunk ending at the center to form a solid pentagon. That pentagon is now a city square, and the city is still occupied to this very day. The idea behind the city was geometric harmony mixed with strong military security. There is even a rumor that Palmanova was inhabited by merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who worked together in order to create a self-sustaining community. Artaxata was an ancient city in Armenia founded by the mighty king Artaxerxes I of the Artaxiad dynasty in the year 176 BC. It soon grew to become the capital of the kingdom, ruling over a massive amount of territory in old Mesopotamia. This city was also a center for Hellenistic culture. It was unimaginably huge, built across a series of tall hills overlooking the river Araxes. It looked like something out of a myth, with tall towers and huge defensive walls. At the tops of the hills were huge palaces and temples dedicated to the ancient gods. Today, the city is still standing, but just barely. The gigantic Acropolis, along with its public baths and dwellings, have all been reduced to rubble. The city's ruins are still on the hills, but it would be impossible to imagine what the place looked like if not for the help from archaeologists. Thanks to years of excavations, we now know just how spectacular Artaxata truly was. Unfortunately, the city was too close to the Roman Empire. In the year 58 AD, the Romans seized the city and burned it to the ground. Emperor Nero sponsored reconstruction about a century later, but the city was destroyed yet again by the Persians in 369 AD. It's a miracle that anything is left of Artaxata at all. La Quemada. La Quemada is a very mysterious archaeological site in Mexico near the city of Guadalajara. According to Spanish chronicler Fray Juan Torquemada in 1615, it was one of the cities briefly occupied by the Aztecs as they migrated into central Mexico. Legend has it that the Aztecs left the children and elderly people at La Quemada so that they would have an easier time conquering tribes they came across. Some say the Aztecs lived here for about 9 years, then marched south with an army that would only be defeated when the Spanish showed up. This begs the question, who built La Quemada? If the Aztec came across its ruins and camped inside its walls for a decade before moving on, who built it first? Historians say it may have been the same builders of Teotihuacan, yet another ancient city that was rediscovered by the Aztecs on their journey through Mexico. Both cities were built sometime around 300 AD, and both are miraculously still standing today. Both of the cities were also abandoned when the Aztecs showed up around 1200 AD. These days, the site is littered with the remains of the city. There's shattered walls everywhere and the imprints of huge avenues big enough for modern tanks to drive through. You can also find foundations for long since destroyed pyramids, as well as ceremonial structures and residential houses. Everything was built out of slabs of clay, so over time the buildings have gradually deteriorated. One of the most impressive structures still standing is the votive pyramid. It's about 30 feet tall and it's only missing a small piece of its top. Archaeologists think there was once a stairway leading up to a small temple room, but nothing remains of it now. The Paseto. The Paseto di Borgo is a secret corridor which connects St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City to the Castel Sant'Angelo. It was used by popes in centuries past as an escape tunnel when their lives were under threat. One of the few recorded incidents when the Paseto was needed came in 1527. This was when the city of Rome was sacked, and Pope Clement VII had to flee his palace and take refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo by traveling through the secret passageway. The Paseto is sitting on ruins that date back to the 6th century AD. After the Ostrogoths took Rome, they built a low wall near the tomb of Emperor Hadrian and linked it to the larger city walls built 300 years earlier. But this wall crumbled shortly after it was constructed, and it was replaced with an even mightier wall around 800 AD, following the coronation of Emperor Charlemagne. The wall was then used as a defensive perimeter around the tomb of Saint Peter, one of Jesus' apostles. However, it was torn down in 816 AD by the people of Rome after the death of Pope Leo III, leaving the tomb utterly defenseless. St. Peter's Basilica was subsequently attacked by pirates twice over the next few decades. Pope Leo IV finally insisted that a new defensive wall should be built on top of the other two ruined walls around 850 AD, likely at the urging of Emperor Lothair I. This wall became permanent, and the Paseto was installed around 1377 for use as a secret passage for popes that needed to make a quick escape. It still stands to this day, built on top of 1,000 years of Roman history. Do you think the Paseto has been used recently by the Pope? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. The Zigurat of Er. When archaeologists began excavating the Zigurat of Er in 1923, it was little more than a hunk of deteriorating stone. This was because this impressive feat of ancient engineering was destroyed in the 5th century BC. But 2,500 years later, a large bulk of the Mesopotamian pyramids still remained, enough to captivate the world's imagination. But what exactly is a ziggurat? It was a pyramid unique to Mesopotamia. In each chief city of the region stood a tall ziggurat, much like the pyramids in Egypt, but with its own special features. These pyramids were tiered, growing smaller and smaller with each stepped platform. There were stairways or ramps leading to each level, and at the summit there was a shrine dedicated to the city's god. It took an insane amount of work to build these ziggurats. It was as if the Mesopotamians were building the Great Pyramid of Giza in all of their major cities. It wasn't even for burying kings, but simply for building altars to the gods. Archaeologists have theorized that it was a way for them to be closer to heaven. The Mesopotamians believed they needed to be closer to the throne of the gods if they were to be taken seriously. The reason the Zigurat of Er is so famous these days is because it's still standing. At least it's the only one still standing in any real capacity. It's been partially reconstructed and looks incredible, so now we just have to go and visit. The Monk's Mound. It's hard to see Monk's Mound in pictures and imagine what it looked like 600 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago. The mound is part of what was once the largest urban settlement in the southeastern United States. In fact, the settlement of Cahokia may have been the biggest city in North America and South America up until its abandonment in the 1400s. Monk's Mound was once an artificial mountain that may have been used for communal gatherings, maybe even with a large temple or other structure on top. It was built by the Mississippian culture and was the largest of 120 earthen mounds inside the ancient city of Cahokia. And although it's difficult to imagine what it once looked like, it's not impossible. The mound is still standing, its platform a whopping 900 feet long. And you can still climb to the top of the mound to where the leaders of the city once addressed their people. Monk's Mound is covered in grass and kind of looks like an overgrown step pyramid, like a ziggurat you might find in Mesopotamia. However, scientists don't know for certain what the mound was used for. They know it was built on a floodplain and that its foundations were likely covered in water for most of the year. But how the mound was used is still a mystery. Caitlin Rankin from the Illinois State Archaeological Survey says the mound may have had something to do with their mythology and worldview. Unfortunately, we don't know what the Mississippian culture believed in. They left nothing behind except the giant earthen mounds in the ruins of their great city. Vani Kabbi. The cave monastery of Vani Kabbi has been around since the 8th century AD. It's one of 2 cave monasteries in Georgia that are so old it's a miracle they haven't collapsed in on themselves. The other monastery is called Vardzia, but Vani Kabbi is far more ancient. A group of religious fanatics began chiseling holes in the side of a mountain 1,200 years ago. They soon constructed a maze of tunnels like an ant nest inside the solid rock. They built 2 megalithic churches carved from raw stone, one with a domed ceiling that still doesn't appear to have so much as a crack in it. Monks lived inside the cold, semi-subterranean chambers with their windows looking out over the wide, empty valleys beyond. There are 19 levels inside the monastery with 200 rock-cut chambers, and the whole thing is situated 600 feet above flat ground. It consists of storage chambers and dusty churches, but you can also find echoing cells where monks sat for countless hours in utter silence. Even after a major earthquake hit the region in the year 1080, the monastery remained unchanged. There is a bit of damage, but the churches are still standing, and the rock-cut tombs are stable enough that you could move a small city inside its walls. When the Ottomans attacked in 1576, the place was completely abandoned, and nobody ever bothered going back. A Greek bathhouse. If you think of a bathhouse, the first place that comes to mind is most likely ancient Rome. The image of old men sitting in steamy rooms discussing philosophy might come to mind. However, the Egyptians were just as fond of baths as the Romans and the Greeks. Evidence has been found of bathhouses used for therapeutic purposes as far back as 2000 BC. And just recently, archaeologists discovered an ancient Egyptian bathhouse still standing after 2,200 years. Standing might be a bit of an overstatement. Archaeologists discovered its foundation in the ancient city of Berenice, located on the coast of the Red Sea. This forgotten seaport was discovered in 1818 and has since been the focus of many excavations. Archaeologists have uncovered temples still partially standing, as well as the remnants of sculptures and inscriptions. They even found some frankincense that had once been part of a vast trading network. You know, like frankincense and myrrh. The bathhouse has been reduced to little more than crumbling structural walls, but at one time it was enormous. It had 14 bathtubs fed by water reservoirs that pumped water out of a well. Visitors to the ancient spa had instant access to hot or cold water. It was likely a popular resting spot for caravans, merchants, and travelers. Peveril Castle. Peveril Castle has been standing over the village of Castleton in England since it was built in 1066. You can still climb to the top of the castle and look out over the sprawling countryside, down into the rural Hope Valley, where the hills climb into the horizon. The castle began its life as a small fortress during the Norman conquest, when the Normans came to England from France and took over the country. The town near the castle became an economic center in northern England, and the castle grew into a stone behemoth. Then, in 1166, King Henry II made improvements to the Acropolis. And although the castle was a mighty fortress, it never got to see a single battle. However, it came close in 1216, when it was given to William de Ferrers as a gift by King John. The appointed castle official refused to give it up, and the king authorized the earl to use force in order to evict its former inhabitant. But the tenant of the castle eventually came to their senses and surrendered without a fight.
The Hapsburg Jaw. The House of Hapsburg was once one of the most powerful families in Europe, ruling over Spain, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire. To consolidate their power and influence, they wanted to make sure they married the most powerful rulers. The problem was, that was each other. Ironically, they became plagued by the ill effects of severe inbreeding, caused by their belief of keeping the bloodline pure. Instead, they caused their own downfall. First cousins frequently got married, uncles and their nieces, and other close relatives. During the 184 years the Hapsburg family formally ruled Spain, between 1516 and 1700, 11 marriages inside the Spanish Hapsburg family were incestuous. Only 2 were not. One of the most notorious genetic diseases was a condition called the Hapsburg Jaw, named after this family. Known under the medical name mandibular prognathism, the condition is characterized by an oversized jawline and a large tongue. You've probably already seen this in many famous historical portraits. Numerous family members had it, including Duchess Mary of Burgundy, Ferdinand I of Austria, and Ferdinand II of Hapsburg, just to name a few. A 2019 study identified 5 family members who appear to have the worst case: Maximilian I, Margaret of Austria, Charles I of Spain, Philip IV of Spain, and Charles II of Spain. By the time King Charles II was born, the Habsburgs had been inbreeding for 16 generations. Things got quite confusing. His grandmother was also his aunt, and his mother was his dad's niece. The physical effects of these overlapping connections had become worse over time. Charles II had such a severe case of the Hapsburg Jaw that his top and bottom teeth did not meet. He couldn't chew his food properly, and he could barely speak because his tongue was so huge. The king also suffered from other incest-related health problems, including epilepsy. He didn't start walking until he was 8 years old, and he was prone to falling because his legs were weak and couldn't support his weight. Charles also failed to produce an heir by either of his 2 wives. It's likely that his infertility resulted from hundreds of years of keeping it in the family. He died in 1700 at the age of 39, bringing the Habsburg dynasty to an end. The strokes of Caesar. Historians have always thought Julius Caesar suffered from epilepsy. We know, based on accounts from historians who lived during the days of Caesar, that he suffered from a mysterious sickness in his later years. Historian Suetonius wrote that Julius Caesar suffered sudden fainting fits and uncontrollable nightmares. The historian Appian even wrote that Caesar suffered from convulsions. He once collapsed while on campaign in Cordoba in 46 BC. But was it epilepsy or something completely different? A new examination of the ancient Roman leader's health has found he may have suffered from strokes, not epilepsy. Dr. Francesco M. Galassi from Imperial College London published a paper arguing the Roman dictator suffered from cerebrovascular disease. Francesco says Caesar's condition likely started in the years following his rise in the Roman Republic, then got worse as time wore on. We even know that Caesar's relatives died suddenly while putting on their shoes, meaning he likely had a family history of the disease. But this genetic disease didn't get in his way. Caesar was a force that couldn't be stopped. He began as a Roman general and became the dictator of Rome in 49 BC. He was assassinated in 44 BC, an event that led to the rise of the Roman Empire. King Tutankhamun. King Tutankhamun went down in history for his rise to power 3,000 years ago at the young age of just 9 years old. The discovery of his tomb was one of the greatest finds in modern history. But the young pharaoh died at just 19 and suffered from a lot of health issues. The boy king, buried with incredible treasures beyond your imagination, spent his life plagued by ailments. He had a cleft palate, a club foot, a curved spine, issues with his immune system, and inflammation. Around the time he died, he may have been partly insane from a malaria infection. He was recovering from a broken leg, and he was hardly mobile. He must have been frail, sickly, and near death his entire life. Researchers studied his remains to come to these conclusions using all the latest tech and publishing their results in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The boy king's medical conditions came from generations of inbreeding. By the time he was born, Egypt's pharaohs had been marrying their brothers and sisters for generations, leading to the genetic deficiencies that often cause incest-related issues. In fact, DNA tests indicate that King Tut's mother and father were siblings, and the legacy continued with King Tut himself, who likely married either his sister or half-sister. Found in his tomb were the remains of several infants who also didn't make it, most likely his children. Carsten Pusch, one of the authors of the study, said this guy was suffering. All that being said, we still don't know why the pharaoh died. It was most likely a combination of all his maladies put together, exacerbated by the broken right leg and the malaria slowly eating away at him. I want to give a big shout out to James Gutierrez and Tara Hill. Thanks so much for watching and spending time with us. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Maria the Mad of Portugal. Also known as Maria the Pious, Maria I was the first undisputed queen regent of Portugal. By the time she rose to power in 1777, she had been married for several years to her uncle Pedro, King Dom Pedro III. Together, they had 6 children. During the first 10 years of her rule, things were going very well. She's popular in Portugal these days for her accomplishments, including economic growth and building new palaces and government buildings. One of the most notable achievements was becoming the first monarch of Brazil, and thereby the first European queen of Brazil. But then, in 1786, something changed. Her husband died that year, and she fell into a deep depression. Then, her eldest son died in 1788. Her mental health started to deteriorate, and it's believed she may have suffered from split personality disorder. At the very minimum, she suffered from extreme chronic depression. She started experiencing fits of delirium so extreme, if she wasn't the queen, she likely would have been labeled a witch. She would rant and rave and wander about her estate screaming and crying. Maria was even pinned down and subjected to ghoulish treatments like bloodletting to try and cure her seemingly unstoppable madness. Dr. Francis Willis, King George III's personal physician, officially declared her insane around the late 1780s. As Napoleon began to conquer Europe, her son Prince João unofficially took over her duties, and then Queen Maria and her entire court moved to Brazil in 1807. During this time, she was in a constant state of screaming throughout the entire move, fearing someone was going to torture or rob her. She died in a convent in 1816 at the age of 81. Quite a long life. It must have been really hard for those around her. The exact nature and cause of her illness is unknown, but experts speculate that Maria suffered from bipolar disorder. Her 2 sisters struggled with similar afflictions, suggesting that the condition had been passed down genetically. The Portuguese royal family had a centuries-long history of inbreeding, which most likely contributed to their mental health issues. Mad King George. King George III was the ruler of England at the same time Queen Maria was the ruler of Portugal in the 18th century, sitting on the throne from 1760 to 1820. Most historians refer to him as the Mad King who let the United States slip through his grasp. He lost the American Revolution, but he was also known for his erratic behavior, which began during the 1780s with bouts of mania. He sought treatment, but the condition worsened. During these episodes, George spoke for hours without stopping, to the point where he foamed at the mouth and his voice became hoarse. He frequently repeated himself and wrote sentences that were sometimes over 400 words long. Sometimes his vocabulary was noticeably complex and creative, but there were also times when his expressions were less rich and markedly more basic. George became so incapacitated, Parliament began considering its options for a new ruler. A bill was in the works to authorize the Prince of Wales as acting regent when the king recovered in 1789 and resumed his duties. But the episodes continued, and in 1810, his son stepped into his place. But what happened to him? In 1812, George's personal physicians reported that his urine had a bluish tinge to it. At the same time the report came in, the king happened to be suffering from one of his very intense constipation episodes. He was vomiting, he couldn't use the toilet properly, and he was not in a good mood. King George suffered so many recurring bouts of sickness that he was forced to withdraw from public life. Historians believe King George suffered from something called porphyria, a blood condition that causes aches, pains, and turns urine blue. But many experts have their doubts, and there is a growing body of evidence that suggests the monarch may have suffered from a mental illness. A 2019 study analyzed thousands of letters written by the king and found striking differences between his writing styles when he was symptomatic versus times when he seemed fine. During his mad episodes, he used more complex and colorful words and frequently repeated himself. These tendencies are characteristic of the manic phase of some psychiatric illnesses, including bipolar disorder. King George was the last ruler from the House of Hanover, a family notorious for its inbreeding and incest-related defects. Research has suggested that inbreeding can increase the chances of bipolar disorder among offspring, indicating that King George may have been especially predisposed to it. Emperor Meiji. Emperor Meiji, also called Meiji the Great, was the 122nd emperor of Japan. He came into power in 1867 and ruled until his death in 1912. He was also prone to diseases like you wouldn't believe. At the time of his birth in 1852, Japan was in a state of transition. Emperor Meiji was just a baby, and Japan was shifting from a feudal country into an industrial powerhouse. Within a few short years, Japan had revolutionized itself. It went from a backwater feudal state of fighting clans to a force that would take on the globe in World War II. Emperor Meiji helped it all go smoothly, consolidating power, reforming the political landscape, and becoming the first leader of a new world power. But he also had a long list of health issues. He suffered from diabetes, nephritis, and gastroenteritis, but it would be uremia that ultimately killed him. His kidneys had reached such a state of decay that they could no longer function, meaning the urea normally excreted through urine could no longer leave the body. This substance built up in the emperor's blood until he dropped dead on July 29, 1912. Obesity on the Nile. Cleopatra is one of the most famous rulers of ancient Egypt today. She's renowned across the world for her beauty and cunning mind. She was the last pharaoh to ever rule Egypt, closing the end of a chapter that had lasted 5,000 years. One surprising fact you may not know is that Cleopatra VII was of Macedonian descent. Her ancestor, Ptolemy, was a general and possible half-brother of Alexander the Great, appointed to rule Egypt after his death. His dynasty would last 300 years, spawning 7 Cleopatras. The Cleopatra we know and love became queen in 51 BC and ruled until her death in 30 BC. She had parents who were brother and sister, extremely common in Egyptian tradition. The Egyptians also believed that it was necessary for siblings to marry to keep the bloodline pure. But it is easy to see how this family could have medical issues. We don't know exactly what her health was like while she was alive. Most of what we know comes from a book written about a century after her death. The Greek writer Plutarch gathered all the information he could about Cleopatra and her Roman lover Mark Antony and made a book about it. He described Cleopatra as not flawless or even remarkable. Apparently, nobody thought Cleopatra was good-looking by any stretch of the imagination. She would often make herself look masculine on purpose as a display of strength. This is backed up by coins that have been discovered from her reign. They show Cleopatra as having a thick neck, a large hooked nose, and a pointy chin. Roman propaganda loved to paint her as a debauched temptress, since she kept seducing Roman leaders. But in reality, she suffered from obesity and some physical features that we may not find so beautiful today. However, she seemed to have lucked out when it comes to what could happen if your parents are brother and sister. Obesity and a hooked nose doesn't seem so bad. She outlived most of her family members, several that she assassinated herself. She could speak 9 languages, was extremely charismatic, and showed bravery and political sharpness up until her death. The royal disease. Hemophilia was a disease that ravaged European royalty in the 19th and 20th centuries. The most famous sufferer of hemophilia was Queen Victoria, the monarch of England between 1837 and 1901. She had 9 children with her husband and first cousin, Prince Albert. Queen Victoria also suffered from a relatively rare genetic blood clotting disorder known as hemophilia B. But what does hemophilia B do? It's a blood clotting disorder that can cause severe bleeding. If a person suffers from hemophilia, they become bruised easily and could bleed to death from a very small wound. The disorder can cause even worse issues like excessive nosebleeds and bleeding into joints. Even a small cut can be fatal. The queen passed it down to 2 of her 5 daughters and her youngest son. The queen herself didn't suffer majorly from the disease, which by then had a well-known presence among European royal families, earning it the nickname of the royal disease. But some of the family members she passed it on to weren't as lucky. Victoria's son Leopold died from a hemorrhage after falling at age 30. Daughters Alice and Beatrice were carriers who passed the condition onto several of their children, and 5 of Victoria's grandchildren died from hemophilia-related complications. The royal families of Spain, Germany, and Russia soon found themselves muddled with hemophilia. Scientists have even tested the remains of the Romanov imperial family from Russia, finding their hemophilia was passed down directly from Queen Victoria. The disorder was passed down for 3 generations before it disappeared from the bloodline. Even though Queen Victoria married her first cousin, the disease's presence in the family genes most likely did not result from incest. Hemophilia is typically passed down through a recessive gene carried by both parents, and primarily affects women, but it's rare for it to have such a prevalent presence in a family, suggesting that perhaps the queen herself was inbred, which could help to explain the unusually high occurrence among her descendants. Princess Nahinaena. Princess Nahinaena was the only child of King Kamehameha I and his first-place wife. Kamehameha was the conqueror of the Hawaiian Islands and founder of the Kingdom of Hawaii. But times were changing in the early 19th century. The princess was sent to a Protestant missionary school and raised to be a Christian, shattering centuries of traditional values for the native Hawaiians. When her mother died in 1823, Princess Nahinaena was left to be influenced by the American missionaries. At the same time, the Hawaiian chiefs were trying to maintain control over King Kamehameha's many children, which he sired with various wives. It was a strange time to be royal in Hawaii. Princess Nahinaena remained very close to her half-brother while she was young. She stayed so close that the pair agreed to be married. But even though the Hawaiian chiefs didn't see a problem with it, the Christian missionaries were furious. She was kicked out of the church following the consummation of her marriage to her brother in 1834. In 1835, the shamed princess married the son of a local chief and tried to be forgiven by the missionaries, but they said it was too late for her to repent because she was already with child by her brother. What happened next was utterly tragic. The princess was ignored and shunned by the missionaries, who were rapidly gaining control over the people of Hawaii. The Christians convinced the native Hawaiians to also shun the princess, and so she was forced to live in isolation. Likely because of centuries of inbreeding, her infant died shortly after birth. She never recovered from the tragedy and spent the rest of her life as an outcast, even though she had only been following traditional island values. Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand I of Austria was born in the city of Vienna on April 19, 1793. He was the oldest son of Emperor Franz II. Franz happened to be related to his wife Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily several times over. Sadly, Ferdinand came into the world already suffering. He had severe epilepsy and a rare condition known as hydrocephalus. This is when a person has water in their brain. The extremely bizarre condition caused Ferdinand to have an abnormally big head. This was made more unfortunate by the fact he had a fairly puny body. He had a thin and small frame with a bulbous skull on top. He would have looked frightening as a baby, then more and more frightening as he grew older. Even though the Hapsburg dynasty died out 93 years before Ferdinand was born, the effects of the contaminated bloodline were still being found across Europe. Ferdinand was the result of royal inbreeding continuing throughout European royalty, even if it wasn't as bad as it used to be. His biographers portrayed him as a mental and physical wreck, similar to Frankenstein's monster. However, his biographers also noted that he was interested in natural sciences, was unusually smart, and was able to speak 5 languages. Even though he was horribly hideous physically from his condition, Ferdinand was still something of a genius. He lived a long life, dying in 1875 after 13 years as Emperor of Austria at the age of 82. Thanks for watching! Which royal do you think had it worse? I'm voting for King Tut, but let me know what you think in the comments.
Irish zombies. A recent discovery of 2 ancient skeletons has revealed a secret history of zombies in medieval Ireland. These skeletons were buried in the 8th century, found between 2005 and 2009 during a series of digs located near Lough Key. Archaeologist Chris Reed and his colleagues from the Institute of Technology in Sligo excavated a total of 137 skeletons. However, it's believed that there's at least 3,000 skeletons throughout the general burial site. 2 of these skeletons stuck out as particularly odd. Archaeologists say the individuals were given deviant burials. They must have been considered social pariahs in their life, or at least very strange. Instead of giving them proper Christian burials, these men were dumped into graves. Then they each had a large rock thrust into their mouth. One of the victims was between 40 and 60 years old, and the other between 20 and 30. And although the men were laid side by side, each one was buried at a different time in the 700s. This suggests there had been some type of superstitious outbreak, one which the locals feared they would be attacked by zombies. The stones were wedged violently into the mouths of the dead to prevent them from chewing their way out of their own graves. The medieval people of this small Irish village believed zombies were real, and that they chewed out of their burial shrouds and terrorized the living. Researchers know this wasn't a case of vampire paranoia because the vampire phenomena didn't start until the 1500s. This was 800 years earlier, meaning it must have been zombies. Witch Girl Skeleton. The skeletal remains of a potential witch were recently unearthed at an archaeological dig in Italy. The girl was buried face down in the dirt, likely because the locals believed she was dangerous even in death. Analysis of her bones showed that the girl was only 13 years old when she died, and yet despite her age, she had been rejected as an outcast by her community and was then buried as a witch. The bones of the young girl were found in 2014 at the complex of San Calosero in Albenga by a team of archaeologists with the Vatican. The site itself is a burial ground upon which stands a martyr church dedicated to Saint Caloceras, built around the 6th century and was abandoned in 1593. The girl dates back to the early Middle Ages, though the exact date is unclear. However, being buried face down in the Middle Ages was a form of punishment. Anthropologist Elena Delu says it was also a way to prevent an impure soul from seeking revenge against the living. However, such a punishment was usually reserved for adults, mostly for criminals. Such a thing being done to a teenage girl is unprecedented, but superstition may have played a role in this burial. Further analysis of the bones revealed parodic hyperostosis on the skull. In other words, the young girl suffered from severe anemia. She may have had an inherited blood disorder that caused her to be deficient in iron. This likely resulted in her being under 5 feet tall, and she must have been as pale as a ghost. It was likely her appearance that frightened the villagers, and so they deemed her a witch. Polish lady vampire. The skeleton of a lady vampire has just been found at a cemetery in Poland. Archaeologists came across the shocking remains at a gravesite in the village of Pien, and some have described the discovery as pure astonishment. What they uncovered was a woman who had been buried for 300 years or more, with a sickle placed around her neck and a triangular padlock tightened around her foot. The farming tool was almost certainly placed in the woman's grave to prevent her from rising as a vampire. The locals must have been fearful she would rise from the dead and begin to suck people's blood. The whole point of the sickle around her neck was to prevent her from sitting up. If the woman tried to raise her body after death, this sickle would have theoretically cut her head off. However, this was no ordinary vampire woman. The research team said the woman was also wearing a silk headdress. The headdress was woven with gold and silver thread, material that's not readily available to commoners. The vampire woman was clearly someone wealthy, and she may have been very important. She could have been a royal vampire, perhaps a queen of medieval vampire society. Then again, she could have just been a rich farmer's wife, wrongly accused of vampirism. Whatever the case, these kinds of burials were popular in the 17th century. That time period was the height of the vampire epidemic in Poland, when corpses were burned, smashed with stones, or even dismembered before being buried. Prehistoric zombies. Evidence has recently been discovered in the country of Jordan that proves zombies have been terrifying the minds of humans for at least 9,000 years. At an ancient farming site in the middle of the Jordan desert called Zigurat of Er, skeletal remains were found by Danish archaeologists. They uncovered proof that the ancient farmers buried their dead only after they had decomposed completely. The farmers waited until the deceased were nothing but skeletons before they laid them to rest. But even then, the dead would not remain in one place. The bones would be separated, split up, and buried in different locations. Some of the bones would be buried in makeshift coffins, while others were buried under the floors of houses. Researchers say this may have been done because of their fear of zombies. As of right now, the discovery of these bones is extremely mysterious. Excavation leader Moritz Kinzel from the University of Copenhagen says nobody knows if the people buried here were related, or even if they died at the settlement. Only about 70 zombie burials have been discovered at the site of Zigurat of Er, located close to the ancient city of Petra. All evidence points to a society of ancient humans who believed that if left alone, dead people would come to life and become zombies. The Thracian Vampire. Bulgaria is home to an ancient Thracian site called Perperikon. People have lived in the ancient city since at least 5000 BC, and it's changed a lot over time. It was in this city that Medokos declared himself king of Thrace in 424 BC. There was once a palace here, a gigantic fortress, and temples built by the Roman Empire after they conquered the area. Then, as time wore on, a church was constructed, likely the first ever built in Bulgaria. In the 13th century, the city became inflamed with anti-vampire rituals, and in order to combat the undead enemy, many people were given vampire burials. One such individual was recently uncovered by archaeologists in 2014. They were found with an iron rod hammered through their chest, just like what you would expect to see with a staked vampire. The person was a man, likely in his 40s at the time of death, and clearly he hadn't been much liked by his neighbors. After he died, he was given a sloppy burial and had a metal rod stabbed through his heart to keep him in his grave forever. The archaeologist who made the discovery said they had no doubt he was the victim of an anti-vampire ritual. Medieval Witch. The grave of a medieval witch was recently uncovered in a Polish graveyard in 2018. This witch suffered a horrendous death before being tossed into a pit and covered in dirt. When researchers led by archaeologist Karol Piasecki investigated her skeletal remains, they made some shocking discoveries. After this woman died, someone drilled holes through her body as a way to anchor her to the ground. They then covered her with bricks so that she couldn't possibly get back up. Unfortunately, the witch suffered significantly before her death. In medieval Poland, any woman accused of sorcery could be subjected to just about anything. Based on this fact, she was most certainly tortured before being executed. The weird part is that she wasn't burned, which was typical in medieval Europe if you were labeled a vampire or a witch. DNA tests show she was a woman, likely with blonde hair and blue eyes. She may have been accused of witchcraft simply for being the lover of a wealthy man who got bored of the relationship. According to Piasecki, the alleged witch lived in either the 16th or 17th century. She's currently being examined by scientists at the Regional History Museum in Kamień. The director of the museum is hoping to one day reveal what the witch looked like using facial reconstructive technology. The Vampire of Venice. The Vampire of Venice was another victim of medieval Italian brutality. The alleged vampire was discovered by scientists with the University of Florence in 2009. She was buried in a mass grave of plague victims on Lazaretto Nuovo Island. This was not an island you would have wanted to visit during the Middle Ages, because it was likely overflowing with dead bodies festering with the Black Death. In the 16th century, Italy and much of Europe was being ravaged by the bubonic plague. But since this epidemic took place before modern science, nobody understood how it was spreading. Instead, they blamed supernatural entities and paranormal monsters. The favorite scapegoat during the plague was the vampire. People really did believe vampires spread the plague by drinking people's blood. They were seen as human mosquitoes, transferring the disease from one person to the next after chewing out of their burial shrouds and rising from their graves. The reason people believed this likely had to do with what happened to a plague victim after they died. Even after death, people affected by the horrible disease continued to spit up blood. In the end, it all had to do with blood. And so, any individual suspected of being a vampire was buried with extreme prejudice. The Vampire of Venice had a large brick shoved into her mouth so hard it nearly separated her jaws. She herself had most likely been a victim of the plague and had been spitting up blood before she died. The people around her would have been terrified, and so they accused her of being a vampire. The Saxon Witch. Charles Wood, an amateur metal detector enthusiast, made the best discovery of his life in 2015. He was on a social dig with a couple of friends near Long Compton in England when he uncovered the remains of a 1,400-year-old skeleton. As if finding an ancient body wasn't amazing enough, It turned out she was likely accused of being a Saxon witch. Charles is not a professional archaeologist, but he is an IT professional who happened to have his metal detector at the right place to make an amazing discovery. In order to help with the dig, he enlisted the help of professional archaeologist Annie Bayard. Together, they removed 6 feet of soil to reveal the skeletal corpse of a 5-foot-tall woman. They dubbed her Rita and believe she may have been a famous historical figure known as the Rollright Witch. According to the local legends, there was a witch that lived around the area where the skeleton was found. She allegedly turned an unknown king and 4 of his most loyal knights to stone. These now make up the famous Rollright stones, which many believe to be the preserved bodies of the 5 petrified men. Rita may have been the Rollright Witch, or at least the inspiration behind the tale. The Vampire Witch. A vampire witch was killed in the 18th century and buried in Poland. Her remains were found by archaeologists in 2014, adding to the already long list of vampire burials found in the European country. Poland was one of the worst perpetrators of vampire violence, and they also had a proclivity for burning witches. To be labeled as a vampire witch was the worst of both worlds. The woman was buried with the usual anti-vampire custom. She had a piece of brick jammed into her mouth to prevent her from escaping her grave. However, she must have been seen as extremely dangerous because the villagers took things to the next level. They also drove stakes through her legs to pin the woman to the bottom of her grave. Scientists working with the Pomeranian Medical University carried out forensic analysis of the woman's skeleton. They learned she was at least 65 upon her death, maybe even older. She was also around average height for medieval Poland, 5 feet 6 inches. Her hair was blonde, her eyes were blue, and she was tortured mercilessly before her death. Researchers have speculated another use for the brick in her mouth. It may have been to prevent her from biting through her burial shroud, but it also could have been meant to silence her tongue, preventing her from casting spells in her grave. John Barber. A skeleton was found in a grave in Connecticut in 1990, and when it was unearthed, scientists were extremely confused. They discovered that the bones of the skeleton had been mysteriously rearranged. The skull was positioned above the rib cage, and a lot of the other bones were shifted and put in different places. This may have been done by the family of the deceased to prevent them from reanimating themselves and to stop them from leaving their grave. Not much is known about this skeleton, although researchers have been able to put together some clues. The individual died in the early 1800s and was buried in a coffin with JB55 written on it. He was also found near another coffin with NB13 inscribed on it. Additionally, a diary from 1826 was discovered in the vicinity, and it mentioned the death of a boy named Nathan Barber. It's believed NB13 stands for Nathan Barber, 13 years old, and JB likely stands for John Barber, 55 years old. Historians believe John Barber was a farmer. However, because he died in the early 1800s of tuberculosis, a time when Americans had very little medical knowledge, he was labeled a vampire. Just like with the Black Plague in Europe, Americans in the early 19th century believed vampires carried tuberculosis. Whoever buried John was under the assumption he had contracted vampirism, which made him sick. They thought John would rise after his death and give his vampirism to the rest of the farmers in the area. So they disassembled his skeleton to make sure he stayed dead. Thanks for watching! Do you believe in vampires or other strange creatures that walk among us? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and I'll see you next time. Bye!